I'm Michael McConkey, and this is Reaction Norm. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Patricia Vino. How you doing there, Patricia?
Good morning, Michael. I'm well.
That's good. Nice to see you again, as always. And for this episode, and maybe for some future episodes, we're joined by the mysterious Charles, who is also Reaver on Twitter, the notorious Twitterer Reaver. So you should definitely follow Charles on Twitter if you don't already. So how you doing there, Charles?
Doing good well.
Very good.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Charles is also a member. We've mentioned in the past that Patricia and I are part of this long-standing Vancouver institution now. What is it, 5-6 years, this evolution and behavior book club study group. And I guess the three of us, I was thinking about this, I guess the three of us are like, since that club became a focused on these biological evolutionary questions, we're like the three founding members who are still there, right? I mean, the other people are gone, and we have some new people, but we're the three originals, right? So there you go.
Yeah, I'd say that's accurate.
Yeah, so there you go. So this episode, we're discussing the question of whether or not morality is progressive. And there's some issues to parse here. There's a number of people, Sam Harris and Michael Shermer certainly come to mind. I think you can make the case maybe for Steven Pinker, possibly Jordan Peterson, people who make the position that we're getting more moral, that we're more moral now than we were in the past, and this is kind of an arc moving towards an ever morally perfecting place. Now we want to, first of all, we want to make a distinction here between different claims that are related. And these are claims around the question of, first of all, maybe we're getting more knowledgeable. Is science allowing us to become more knowledgeable about the world? That's quite possibly true. And another claim is that we're becoming more materially better off, where people live better quality lives, they live longer lives, and all this kind of thing. This argument is associated most recently to Steven Pinker with Enlightenment Now, but other people like Julian Simon and Matt Ridley have made this argument in the past. So those are related issues, but I think separate from the question of whether we're becoming more moral people. So that would be sort of my general outline of the issue that we're dealing with. I have a particular take on this that I'm going to put to the two of you and everyone listening at some point. But to start off, why don't each of you comment on what your impressions are of this question? Any thoughts you have at all to get us started? Patricia, why don't you start?
Sure. I just think that I love the language that's used around this, where our morals are becoming better, or we're progressing, or we're going, it makes it sound like we're going somewhere, we're improving to some like inevitable end. And it seems like you're moralizing morality, which I just think is a funny position to judge morality in other cultures or as other times as good or bad. It's impossible to kind of take yourself outside this. So I just think that it is a funny thing that we end up moralizing morality itself.
That's right. So we're actually more moral because we're more moral, right? We get to pat ourselves on the back because we're more moral, right? Okay, Charles, what's your initial thoughts about all this?
Yeah, I'd say like, I mean, there was one part that we're getting morally better, but what does better mean, right?
Yeah.
You can take a look at from multiple different points of view. Like, for example, maybe there's some moral fashion around some kind of ethical framework, and we're becoming more of that, for example. Or you could take another approach where it's like, okay, maybe it's like first survive, then reproduce. So it's moral in that sense. And then you can look at whether it's somatic, for your body survival, or whether it's for genetic survival for your descendants. You can also look at short-term versus long-term trade-offs. But like, I don't think most people like think in those terms. I think it's probably some moral framework they have, some ethical framework that they have a preference towards, and they are claiming that we're becoming more of what's considered good, and that is being realized. I think that's probably the claim. But then that's somewhat subjective, right? Like, what happens if two people claim and they have different ethical frameworks? Now, you can claim there's probably some overlap, and maybe there is, but it's not exactly the same, right?
Yeah. I think that the gist of the claim here is something along the lines of, well, we used to have slavery and we got rid of that, and women used to not have rights and now they have rights, and sort of like the sort of looking back in the past and writing the story from the present, sort of like, well, look at all the things that we consider immoral that existed in the past, and that's not there anymore, and so as a consequence.
And this idea that we're like uncovering new moral truths as if they're scientific discoveries.
Right.
I think kind of fits into it. That they're out there for us to realize, and as we, with rationalism, wherever, as we explore these ideas, that we uncover new truths.
Yeah.
Well, so some of that might be the case. I mean, there are certainly things that are part of like human morality that are likely specific to us, right? But there might be things that are kind of encoded in our moral instincts that could be somewhat universal. Like think like if tit for tat, for example, like, I mean, like, it's not say like it's tit for tat, but like consider an algorithm like tit for tat. That's something that could be discovered through evolution, and, humans could, evolve that in, other animals could evolve that in, aliens on separate planets could evolve that in, right?
Right,
so, I mean,
but that's not discovering. I mean, that's explaining a mechanism of how something works, right? That's not really necessarily saying that this is a new truth, right? As if like slavery is wrong.
Yeah. I mean, so that's a little different. I guess I'm debating the claim that there's no moral truths or something you can interpret as a moral truth out there, right? There might be some kind of algorithms or structures that maybe are optimal in some sense, right?
Right, and I think that this is where we're going to go with it, right?
Yeah,
Michael.
Yeah. No, I think that I think that's true, Charles. I think that they're part of the idea of human morality, I think, is rooted in biology, and it is emergent out of evolutionary forces. But to me, to the extent to which we're human, we all participate in that in some way or other. And I think that's part of why I have problems with this claim of a moral arc. But maybe I'm thinking maybe before we really get into the nitty-gritty of it, it's probably valuable for some people watching to, whenever people do actually watch it, to identify a couple of concepts that I know that we all three share, but others watching this down the road may not share. So the first is to understand what a phenotype is, because I, for one, am going to want to appeal to the concept of a phenotype in this discussion. So if you'll give me just a minute here, a couple minutes to elaborate this. I think a useful way of getting a grip on this is the old idea that Cosmedes and Toobies developed of jukebox land. They actually developed this idea to argue against cultural relativism, but I think it's a useful idea also for understanding phenotype. So the idea here then is that you go to some foreign planet which is completely occupied by jukeboxes. Everywhere there's jukeboxes, and the interesting thing is that inside. Oh, and by the way, we should clarify, just in case younger listeners don't know what a jukebox is. Jukebox is this old machine that has records inside it, and you can put your money in and play a record, choose a record to play. Okay, because you've never seen those. I mean, maybe in old movies you've seen them.
You have to explain what a record is.
That's right. These vinyl round things. All right, whatever. I think people can look it up. Go to Wikipedia and look up jukebox and vinyl record. All right, so we got the same. All the jukeboxes have exactly the same records inside them. But the interesting thing, they all have a little mechanism in them so that at different locations on the planet, different longitude and latitude of places on the planet, the jukeboxes play a different song. So we come to this planet and we see these jukeboxes, but as we travel around the planet, they're all playing different songs. And we think that, oh, well, there's all these, look at the incredible diversity of jukeboxes, right? There's so many different jukeboxes. But in fact, they're all exactly the same in terms of the content. Now the records, there's kind of two possible metaphors here. One possible metaphor is to think of as sort of the genetics, right? The genetics of the jukeboxes are the records that they have inside them, right? But the idea of the phenotype then is that given a different, and so the basic, I should have said this off the top, like the basic definition of phenotype is it's how the particular genome or genotype interacts with an environment, and what emerges out of that is the phenotype. So in a certain sense, you can say these genetically, if you like, these jukeboxes are all exactly the same, but given the different places on the planet they're expressed in a different way because they're playing a different record, right? So that's okay. So I have more to say about that, but as a first approximation, is that helpful, do you think, guys, as explaining phenotype? Or do you want to add something to this?
Right. So in this case, the phenotype would be what's playing, right? Whether it's the Beatles or the Rolling Stones.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Or that would be the distinctive phenotypic feature that we're focusing on. Yeah.
So I want to add something just to try to make it more clear for people who are less familiar with this. So, for example, in a lot of cases, phenotypes might be something like how an individual looks, or how an organism looks, or how an organism behaves. And an organism can be a human, of course, but the looking and behaving. And for the example you gave, it's more about, I think, the behavior and that, what it's playing. And you can, I mean, like, some of this I think touches a bit on adaptations, even though you didn't say the word adaptation, that each of those organisms has a different phenotype, but there's the same adaptation behind it. And if you took that organism and either just dropped it in that other place, or it might require that the person grew up in that other place, for example, had different kind of developmental history, like, having different environments when they're very young, or in the mother's womb, or, in teenage years or whatever, then because it has the same adaptations, it would have that other phenotype that's more characteristic of that location.
Yes, that's right. And okay. And what I'm going to emphasize here, obviously, is that also I'm going to emphasize that attitudes, not only behaviors and morphological features, but attitudes can be phenotypic, right? And I think is that kind of what you're getting at, right? So we can talk about a particular moral phenotype.
Yeah.
Right. So like as we look at the planet as it exists today, you can travel around different cultures and you find subtle differences, or sometimes dramatic differences, in terms of what people do and do or do not consider moral. And those would be forms of phenotype.
Right.
Yeah. So I think like one way that can be thought of is that we all have the same adaptations that give us our morality. And we all have the potential for all these different kind of moral phenotypes. It's just given, how we grew up and where we grew up and what we experienced, we show a different kind of like moral phenotype, but we all have the same potential for all the different variety.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so that what you said there allows me then to extend on to the second part of this analogy. So of course the name of our show, and by the way, I should mention the name of the show comes from Charles. Charles coined the name of the show. So let's tip our hat to Charles. Thank you. So we should explain for people who don't know what reaction norm means. Then the reaction norm is the constraint of possibility, because you have these, as Charles is saying, you have these evolved adaptations. And that give rise to different phenotypic expressions when faced with different environmental cues, but not anything is possible. Certain things are possible, and what is possible is what's the reaction norm, the capacity. And you could think, I was saying that the records inside the jukeboxes could be thought of as the genes. One analogy you can think of as the genetic of the jukeboxes. Another way to think of it is that it's actually the reaction norm of the potential phenotypes of the jukeboxes, because they can only play the records that are actually in the jukebox, right? That's the limit of what this particular jukebox species can actually do, right? So you can think of that as a reaction norm. So we all have, all species have a reaction norm in terms of the phenotypic possibilities within them, right? We agree on that?
Yeah, that's a lot of complex words for probably a lot of people.
Well, we have high standards on this show, Charles. We have high standards.
Right. So I think just to summarize what we said, it's sort of that every human would have, maybe for lack of a better word, the heart for morality, and depending on where you are and what sort of environment you're interacting with, that's going to sort of like manifest itself and give you a different output depending on.
Yeah, but like there is, oh, you froze, but there is some more specifics in terms of like where you are. For example, where you are could relate to your perception of what you might call social status, right? Whether it's dominant status or prestige status, whether you feel threatened, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Not just like physically where you are.
Yeah, you're talking about emotional experience.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, and I mean, like you do have individual differences. Like, well, you know, everyone has the same adaptation, so we have the same potential for all this, you know, variety, but each individual might be tweaked and tuned a bit differently, right? So their genetics might tilt them a bit more. Like, for example, this person might be a little more compassionate than the other person just through their genes, right? Just have that more potential there. And the environments, you know, in the womb, the environments when they're young, the environment throughout their life, you know, like basically like environment could be people, it could be culture, it could be the temperature, you know, whatever, right?
Yeah.
It can then take you from your initial kind of inclination and take you in a radically different direction, or, you know, more in the direction you're already inclined towards, right? So it's kind of a mix, right? You have some fine tuning, and it might be that, for example, like maybe you live in an environment where compassion is really important. I'm just using an example of compassion. It doesn't have to be compassion, but, and because you're a little more in that direction, you might have an advantage, right? Like you have a head start, and like just through stuff like, you know, the Matthew effect, the virtuous cycles, like you might have an advantage over, you know, other people just because you had that initial head start, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So do you think we've covered phenotype? Do you think we've given people a sense of what's going on?
If we don't, another episode could be done. So
this is true. This is true. Okay. So then the second point I wanted to lay down before we can really get going full bore into the topic is it's the whole idea, and we've sort of touched on this already a little bit, is the idea of the evolution of morality, right? And we're all familiar with arguments by people like Richard Alexander and Rob Kurzban and his various co-authors, co-researchers he's worked with around the issue of morality. So I don't know, does one of you want to take a shot at, you know, giving a summary of this this evolutionary idea of morality? Any takers?
Whose idea?
I mean, just an overview of what, you know, the idea that evolution is evolved.
Okay, so I'll tell in terms of the story. Actually, so years ago, like a long time ago, when I started getting into this stuff, I came across Jonathan Haidt, Haidt. I can't pronounce his last name. It's Haidt, something like that, right?
Yeah.
And it actually affected me in a way. So he looks at kind of like what structure there might be to human morality, right? And you know, the tough thing when you talk about morality is people think you're trying to tell them, you know, what you should think is right and wrong, and that's not what this conversation is about. The conversation is like, look that human morality exists. Look that people have these preferences. They have a feeling of right and wrong and all that stuff, and just observe that it's different between individuals. It's different, but there's also similarities, right? And Jonathan Haidt, he came up with a model, right? A framework for how he thinks that structure looks. Now, you know, reasonable people can debate whether this model is correct or not, right? But I think it's quite interesting that he kind of went into that. Just to give a bit of a side story about myself, I think I got into this like, I think it was something like the mid 2000s, right? Like, so something like, I don't know, 2006, 7, like I'm not quite sure the date and when he started like making circles more in the kind of like sciencey blogosphere and all that stuff. But I got, you know, exposed to it at one point. And prior to that, I felt there was an absolute right and wrong. And after getting exposed to this stuff, it kind of like bothered me at first that, you know, it's just in your head, right? Now, that does not mean that, you know, morality isn't useful. And I couldn't live in a way where I didn't act as if, you know, morality was this real thing. And I think now, like, I don't even think it's necessary to have it be a real thing. It's okay. It's just in your head. But anyways, so Jonathan looks at the structure, and he has a model, and he basically, I think he divides it into 6 dimensions. And if I knew we were going to discuss this, I would have wrote them down, but let me just see if I can do it from memory. So one of them is fairness. One of them is fairness / justice. The other one's care harm. The other one's authority, respect. The other one's purity, sanctity. The other one's liberty, oppression, and I'm forgetting one. I can't remember what the other one is. But he comes up with this structure, and his arguments is that people are kind of tuned a bit on these things, right? So some of these are elevated higher, some of these are elevated lower. So maybe someone's really high on all 6 of these dimensions, but maybe some people, they're only high on 2 of them, maybe fairness and liberty or something like that, and the rest are kind of suppressed. Like some people, they don't care as much, or they don't seem to express as much about, say, authority, for example. I think my opinion is I kind of question some of this. I know that you can be misled depending on how you ask these questions when you do a study. Like, for example, like think of like how he comes up with this. Well, he has a survey and he asks them a whole bunch of questions, right? And depending on the questions you ask, you might find, okay, well, this person doesn't care about purity, sanctity, or authority as much. But sometimes these questions could miss the expression of that kind of trait in certain individuals just because you didn't ask it the right way. But anyways, that's his take. I guess stepping back, you can kind of think of that. Humans have different adaptations around being social. Like humans are quite social. We live together. We work together. Like a lot of animals would rip each other apart if you put them in this close quarters. There was something I was reading. I can't remember what it is, but it was arguing that about humans being social. And he gave the example of if you put a bunch of humans on an airplane, they're annoyed at each other, but they're pretty, civil towards each other. But if you put a bunch of chimpanzees, they would rip each other to shreds, right, in that close quarters. And okay, so we have a bunch of adaptations around being social, and it seems like these are different adaptations, and they're evolved for different things, and different things means there was problems that existed in the environment, and they solved those problems. And collectively, we seem to label a lot of these morality, right, or the expression of that morality. And people have a lot of things built on top of this, right? Like people have ethical frameworks, religion, law, and all of that. But it seems a lot of this seems to not in totality, but some of those things seem to be a manifestation of an expression of these moral instincts we have, right? Just to give an example, think of incest avoidance, right? Like there can be genetic problems if you were, for example, to have kids with a sibling, right? Just really quick, each individual has a bunch of mutations, right? So you get 2 copies of every gene. You have a bunch of mutations, and most mutations are slightly harmful, right? And the lucky thing is, or I should say, but some mutation is absolutely necessary for evolutionary adaptation. So it's not the process is not strictly a bad thing that you want to avoid. But most mutations are slightly harmful. So let's say one copy of your gene is mutated, it doesn't work, right? Well, you're lucky, right? Because you have 2 copies, and you probably have another working copy, and you'll be fine for the most part, right? Now, if you were to, have a child with your sibling, like, if you're a male and you have your child with your sister or vice versa, that child could get the 2 copies, the broken copies, right? Because you're so closely related, and you might both contain that, broken gene, right? And in that case, there could be disease. And of course, well, what does that mean? Well, it means like the child might die, or the child might not have as many descendants or no descendants at all. And well, what's the problem with that? Well, this can cause problems when you compare like one organism having children versus other organisms. If other organisms are able to like produce more descendants, then that has an advantage, and those genes will spread more. So in this case, you can think that, okay, well, a child having those 2 broken genes, like this can cause problems for having the rest of the genes pass on. And it seems like organisms have created adaptations to kind of like protect themselves against this. And there's different mechanisms for this, right? Like, for example, children raised together before a certain age tend to not to find each other sexually attractive, right? And the 2 examples I remember, there was these kind of socialist compounds in Israel called kibbutz. And I actually have a friend who was in one of those. But I think the idea, and I might get some of these details wrong, but I think the idea is the children would grow up together, and then they, when they become teenagers or adults, they hook up and fornicate and have descendants and grow the village. And what it seemed like is these children usually didn't find each other.
I think the idea was that they get married, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, I know that's just a detail, but it wasn't just to make like.
I mean, it was actually the goal, right? The convinced vision was that the children will grow up and marry each other. Yeah. That was the vision in animating the whole social experiment, right?
Yeah. So, but anyways, it didn't seem to work out that well, just because these individuals didn't seem to find each other sexually attractive. I think the other example that's commonly give is the Chinese Xinpao marriage. And if I remember correctly, that's where a Chinese family would adopt the child from a poor family and compensate them somehow, sometimes financially or whatnot. And then the idea is that the girl and their son would grow up together and get married and then fornicate and, produce descendants and all that stuff. And as far as I know, like that also tended not to work out because the children didn't find each other sexually attractive because they grew up together. There are some other mechanisms, for example, seeing, children with your mother and et cetera, et cetera. But anyways, we seem to have these adaptations around preventing individuals from, like brother and sister from hooking up and having children, right? And of course, the adaptation can make mistakes. If you raise children together, it makes mistakes, but that's not really the point. The point is these adaptations exist. Now we have layers on top of this, like social layers. For example, there's taboos. You might call some of these taboos being part of religion or being social norms or being the law. But in this particular case, this expression of what you might call culture is a manifestation of biology. Now, that is not to say that all culture is a manifestation of biology, right? Like some of it, some culture, I actually think it's quite interesting. Some culture seems to be kind of like this machine learning artificial intelligence system that learns in that technical sense that you use in computer science, right? Like evolves, I guess, in the more common language. And it evolves to solve problems that people often don't know exist. And so I'm just like pointing that out to say that I'm not claiming that all culture is a manifestation of biology, just some of it is. But anyways,
that's a discussion for another episode.
Yeah.
There's a lot to be said there, but maybe we should just do you said it really well, but maybe we should just try and do like a brief synopsis of like the main points, being that morality is an adaptation that is designed by evolution to solve a problem of humans living in large groups with other individuals with whom we are not close genetic relatives.
I think that's right. But I also want to emphasize something else here in the example that Charles was giving, is that that's an example. The whole incest avoidance thing is an example of a case where it's not necessarily obvious that morality is required, right? Because it seems to be a natural tendency for siblings, say, to be repulsed at the idea of having sexual congress with their own siblings, right? It's the mechanisms that Charles was talking about are operating at a biological level, operating unconsciously. So yes, we have, as you said, sort of religious and other traditions lay a moral condemnation over top of that, but it's not clear that without that moral condemnation that all these siblings would be running off and fornicating together. It doesn't seem as though they would. So that's almost, to me, a different kind of case than saying, well, we got rid of slavery. Like if I was making the moral arc argument, I would not use that as an illustration of the moral arc, right? Because I'd say, as Charles was pointing out, there's fitness interests, down at the genetic level to not screw up the possibility of replicating the selfish gene into the future by mating with this person who's too closely genetically connected to me. Whereas I could make the moral arc argument around the case of slavery because there's no real benefit to me, apparently, though it would seem, by getting rid of slavery and treating other people different. So this seemed to me as though they might be slightly different cases. I don't know if you guys want to respond to that.
So let me ask you a question around that. I guess one question is, because I think you're making this distinction. I hadn't really thought of that. Do you think there's things that we call morality that are not a manifestation of our biology somehow?
No. but at a different level. I think, than you're putting it. I think that example is an example that's operating at the level of at the more immediate level of the selfish gene. Whereas I think the others are, not the others, but others, like this whole question of slavery, for instance, or female suffrage or whatever, those are operating at the level of more phenotype, where given specific social material conditions have changed in such a way that the cues coming are different, and therefore the phenotype, the moral phenotype is different.
Okay.
So that's still biological, but it's at a different, the more phenotypic level, right?
Yeah. So I guess in terms of slavery, I think I would think of it in terms of like dominance and anti-dominance. Like think of in terms of like what is it, Hiroki and the Farce type stuff, maybe.
Yeah.
I guess it's goes way beyond that, but like that we, you know, humans seem to have two forms of social status, right? Well, two known anyways, like dominant status and prestige status. And at least with dominance, we also seem to have adaptations around being dominated, like to react to that. And it seems that some of that is in play, at least with problems with slavery. Maybe also like, you know, kind of fairness. Maybe you can think of it in terms of reciprocal altruism or something like that. Like,
would it be fair to say that there are like layers to this? Like incest avoidance seems to be like a really basic sort of morality that you get around all cultures. And to be fair to Charles too, like that was the example that Haidt used with his like moral dumbfounding, right? With his classic example.
It was one example.
Yeah. He had that example of a brother and sister, you know, using protection, using all this stuff so they couldn't get pregnant. And like part of the story was that and then decided never to tell anyone. And like, do people think it's wrong? Right. And a lot of people still thought it was wrong, even though like nobody found out about it and they avoided everything to get pregnant. Right. And
I mean, I was just throwing here that, I mean, like, I understand why, I understand the reason to bring Haidt into it, but I've never been as persuaded by Haidt's analysis as many other people are. I think Haidt has way too much Durkheim and not enough Darwin, frankly, in terms of his analysis. So in terms of fleshing out this whole question of the evolution of morality, I would actually point more to the work that Kurzban's done with, you know, on his own and with, you know, various other authors. Maybe I mean, actually, maybe we should just briefly mention. I think you have touched upon this, Patricia. I don't know. Do you want to expand on this, you know, Richard Alexander thing and the idea of, you know, how morality emerges from our sociality? Do you want to say a few words about that?
What specifically more exactly did you want me to say? Sorry,
no,
I don't take it in a direction that you don't mean.
No, I mean, you did mention it before, but I just thought, you know, maybe it's worth fleshing out. I mean, I can do it if you want, but I mean.
No. Yeah, it's just, I mean, the idea that humans started living together in bigger groups, and that at some point in human evolution, the selection pressure shifted from that selection pressure, meaning that probably if you were a human, what was more likely to kill you than other things in the environment was other humans. That could be other bands raiding your band, but that was, so humans had to learn how to get along in groups for protection from other humans. And so you had a lot of conflicting and competing interests, and morality, I think Alexander's point is that morality evolved in order to give humans a framework for which to sort of deal with all these conflicting interests. Is that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, that's good. I think that's really a really concise statement of it. Yeah. You know, and then from my perspective, then, you know, Kurzban and his various co-authors have built on this, looking at the way in which people work out social problems using their what I would call their moral phenotype. But it's also interesting to see how the differences, those differences in those moral phenotypes result in ways in which people moralize their self-interest. So the famous example, or famous amongst us, from the Hidden Agenda of Political Mind was the debate around abortion, and how it turns out if you parse that, if you look at the general social survey from the United States, which is like 50,000 data points at the time that they're analyzing it, it turns out that people who fall on the side of pro-life or pro-choice on abortion, it turns out that also have a whole lot of statistical profile that suggests that they have either, in the case of being pro-choice, a much faster sexual strategy, or those who are pro-choice have a much slower sexual strategy. So while we moralize the issue of abortion on, defending women's rights or protecting unborn children, this is sort of the moral argument they make. It turns out when you look a little deeper in terms of their lifestyle choices and attitudes, that in fact really they're just trying to create a social world that's more beneficial for their own particular phenotype around issues of sexual strategy. So does that, you guys want to respond to that?
Yeah, no, I think that you're hitting on a really good point, which is that morality evolved because it was helping you as an individual, that it's ultimately self-serving. I think that often there are appeals that, you are doing something for the greater good or you're doing something selflessly. And we have to remember that while that might be sort of how we veil it, often like our morality ultimately reflects what is good for us or what's good for our in-group or good for our family. Which is exactly what you're saying.
I would just point out, just to make it clear to anyone watching, is that, like, yes, it does seem that a lot of aspects, maybe all aspects or most aspects of morality is encoded in selfishness, right? So it's selfishness towards yourself. But cooperation is a selfless act. Like, it doesn't mean you're being malicious towards others, right? For example, like cooperation is where, you selfishly get what you want, and, you selfishly get what you want, and you selfishly get what you want, and you selfishly get what you want. Like, everyone selfishly gets what they want, and you're all better off for being in that situation than not, right? Yeah. And I think people don't like the word selfish. I'm not sure of like a better word to use, but like if you're not getting what you want, then you're just being taken advantage of, right? And that's not a good situation, right? So like this notion is that you're acting in your own self-interest is, I think, accurate. But then there's structure to this, for example, right? Like, is it somatically selfish? Like, for example, with your body, like, is it like first survive, right? And or is it genetically selfish, reproduce, right? Like have descendants. And are you thinking short-term or are you thinking long-term, right? So there's structures and trade-offs between how you can be selfish, which is an interesting discussion also. But
yeah, and I mean, humans are complex, right? Often doing something in your self-interest, maybe it won't bring you wealth, but if it brings you a tremendous amount of social prestige, this can help you, find a partner or reproduce. So it's not always, like, I think people want to be overly reductionist about it. There are many ways to behave in a self-interested way that doesn't translate to just, like accumulation of resources or.
Yeah. And one other thing to keep in mind is that this is from the kind of evolutionary point of view of like evolutionary adaptations. Like, a human individual isn't thinking in terms of these kind of things. Like, for example, a mother doesn't think, I'm helping my child, and by doing this, I'm passing on my genes, right? A mother feels love and she helps her child. But why does love exist? Like, why does that exist in the first place? And it seems to be adaptation or part of an adaptation to help you propagate your genes, at least in that form, right? Mm-hmm. And it could be that some of these adaptations we have, like maybe across enough individuals, like it works well for helping the organism first survive, then reproduce, right? And have descendants. But it might not work well in all individuals. And it might not, it might have worked in the past. It might not work well now, right? Think for example, think like porn, for example, right? Okay, so you had adaptations, you get sexually stimulated, you want to do something about that, right? And often that might lead you to, if you're a male, like finding a female human, hopefully, and like having sex, right? And sex leading. Was
the hopefully part directed towards the human or the female? I wasn't sure what that was.
So a human male finding a human female. Okay, like being sexually aroused can like induce you to go try to find someone of the opposite sex and have sex with them, and because there's wouldn't be birth control, like you would over time like have a child eventually. Where today, like you can stimulate that adaptation, right? Like, for example, you're on the internet, you see some porn and you can take care of it yourself, all, without having anyone of the opposite sex. Now, that adaptation's at play, but it's operating a way that doesn't really help your fitness, right? And like, there's arguments that there's a number of things like this. Let's not
go too far down that path, because that's an interesting discussion, and that's a whole other episode, right?
So you're talking about whether morality might be an X adaptation. Would that be kind of fair to say, or not necessarily an X adaptation, but
whether it's like it's useful or not?
I think that Yeah, I think that, I mean, there's a huge discussion there about our ability in the modern world to be able to hack our adaptations in ways that are pleasurable to us. And, porn is just, the tip of the iceberg. But, that's a whole other discussion. And,
Yeah.
and of course, to many people, a moral discussion. But I actually want to just, in the conversation you guys had earlier, I just want to emphasize one other point. You guys were talking about the importance of understanding that sort of selfish genes, selfish, phenotype even, doesn't necessarily mean sort of, red in tooth and claw and, each out for themselves, and the cooperation can be part of that. But of course, I also want to emphasize to people watching this that these two things this is the point that one of the points Alexander made about this, is that cooperation and competition are not like conceptually separate things. They're clearly integrated. And in fact, and I think I may have made this point in our last discussion, actually, Patricia, but the idea that Alexander argues that in fact they're nested into each other. When you have a group that's cooperating, first of all, the reason you get groups cooperating for the most part is because there's other groups who are threats to them, right? So they have to cooperate to defend themselves against the village in the next valley who may come and attack us, or sort of thing, right? But even within that cooperation, there's still the opportunity. In fact, there's increased opportunities to free ride on others. Like if we're going to war, if I can sort of get to the back and, let the guys at the front get killed, and I'm there for the victory, great, right? So there's all kinds of ways that you can still compete / free ride on cooperation too. So cooperation and competitiveness are sort of nested into each other all the way down, right? So I think that's an important thing, an important distinction to make, and something to bear in mind as we get more into this whole question of the moral art, which I think we've laid the groundwork now for understanding is to be able to actually talk about this. So as I said, I have a particular axe to grind on all of this, but I know, Patricia, you've been reading Michael Shermer's book on the moral arc, and I think you have some thoughts. Anything particular you'd like to share at this point about your reading of that book?
Oh, I get really annoyed at and I mentioned this before, sort of the teleological language he uses, that we're on some sort of like proverbial escalator to, what this transcendental idea of morality is. And I just think that that's, we've talked about this before, sort of still buying into that whole like Kantian claim that you're uncovering some truth, and not that these are things that have evolved because they're practical and because they're useful and they're solving a problem. And Charles made a good point earlier too, that doesn't change how you feel about it. Like, I think that I would agree, when you read his book, it all feels right. It feels good. You know what I mean? But I just think that he uses a lot of language about progress and improvement and everything, and that bothers me a lot. But I think that Michael, you should grind your axe. It's
Okay. So now that we've laid that down the groundwork, I can say this very, very succinctly, I believe. So my perspective on this, the way that I'm seeing this, is that okay, maybe just one little bit of background detail. I mean, so let's imagine that we all individually have our own moral phenotypes, right? However, I'm not disputing that there's going to be a lot of common ground, right? Because, I mean, most of us, assuming that our moral phenotypes, that we were saying, are acting essentially selfishly, is using morality to try and affect other people, to get the world to be more the way that we want it to be, because it benefits our interest in some way or other, right? So there's still going to be a lot of common ground, because most of us don't want to be killed. So we're going to agree upon sort of a social norm, a sort of a moral norm that, you can't go kill people, right? Now, there's still going to be people who disagree. There's going to be, sociopaths think, hey, you know what, it's okay to kill people. It's okay for me to kill people anyway. So don't kill me, but, I can kill other people. So there's still going to be exceptions. But for the most part, we're going to have agreement on a lot of things, right? But it's on the sort of marginal cases where you can sort of, if you can make a moral case strong enough so that you can get someone else to be more more vigorously enforce or conform to the social norms than I do, I get kind of a benefit from that. Or if I can mislead you into thinking that something is a social norm and should be when it's not, and that you do something that's to my benefit, I get a benefit too from. So morally, these are ways that moralizing can be self-serving. Okay, so just keeping all that in mind. So here's the way I see it. Okay, yes, of course, at any particular time, even though there's all these different moral phenotypes, there's going to be a lot of common ground. But the point is, these moral phenotypes, despite their differences, all in some way are emerging out of an interaction with a particular social material reality. And that's why, anthropologists have long noted that if you go around, maybe less so today because the world's becoming more and more globalized through technology, but as recently as 60, 70 years ago, you could travel around to different parts of the world and find quite significantly different consensus or aggregates of moral phenotypes around certain moral norms within different places because they were different societies confronted with different social material conditions. So what I'm going to argue is that what's true geographically is also true historically. And this, to me, it seems like it should be obvious. So in different times in the past, people were living in different social material conditions. And as a result, a different cluster of moral phenotypes emerge. So again, if you think of a reaction norm of human moral phenotype as being a territory, right? They were in a different part of the reaction norm, right? Because they were confronted with different environmental cues and responded to them differently. And different, you go through sort of historical periods, A, B, C, D, let's say we're D, right? Each one of these was slightly different or sometimes dramatically different social material conditions and therefore different set of moral phenotypes. And as a consequence, a different place, located a different place in the reaction norm. So this can give the illusion, it's that, oh, we're getting better. But it only appears as though we're getting better because we're judging those places, those different social material conditions and the phenotypes that they gave rise to from the perspective of ours, where we all more or less share. I mean, of course, there's differences, but we largely share our ideas about what is moral because we're all part of the same social material conditions and the same sort of location in the reaction norm. And my point is that if you can imagine into the future, so what did I say? We were D? So E, F, G, H, other social material conditions going into the future, they're going to be confronted with different social material conditions than us. They're going to be, their moral phenotypes are going to be clustered at a different part of the reaction norm, and it's going to be different from ours. So that we're going to look, if we can look into the future and see this, H world, it's going to seem as immoral to us as the A world seems immoral to us. And it's not a question that one is more moral than the other. Each is more appropriate to the social material conditions, the environment that gives the cues to generate the specific moral phenotypes that are appropriate to that environment. So this idea that we're on an arc or that we're improving is just the illusion of looking at the past and seeing how it has become more and more similar to us. But it's going to keep changing in the future, and quite likely, if we could see 1,000 years, 2,000 years in the future, what those people believe, we might consider extremely immoral, right? So this idea of an arc to me is just an illusion. That's my case.
So you're saying that that whatever our morality is, this is just what the product of the environment and our moral framework. And it's not, I don't want to say inevitable, but this is just what is going to pop out. We haven't really done anything active on our part. Do you understand what I'm saying? Or does that make any sense?
Well, I mean, it's okay. I mean, I wouldn't say it's not a product of human action, right? It's a product of human achievement, right? And the changing social material conditions through history.
But it's not a product of human rationality.
Oh, well, no. I mean, of course, human rationality always plays a role at the level of individual plans and sort of thing, right? But it's not like the history is a product of human design. I don't think there's any case to be. I mean, I'm sure people would argue that, but I don't think any of us would argue that. Yeah. So yeah, no. It's just it seems as though we're more moral because we live in the society that gave rise to our particular moral phenotypes. That's all. That's why we think we live in a more moral world, because we're evolved for this world, right? And we think that we're morally superior to people in the past because they had different moral phenotypes, and we see the illusion of an arc, because as the social material conditions change to come closer and closer and more resembling our own, those moral phenotypes change to become more and more like our moral phenotypes. So that's why you appear to have this moral arc. But like I say, history isn't going to stop, and it's going to keep going on. There's going to be new social material conditions which are going to be different environmental cues that are going to give rise to different moral phenotypes in the future, and those moral phenotypes are going to be as different from us as the ones, you know, thousands of years ago are also from us. Thousands of years from now, they're going to be as different from us as they were thousands of years before were different from us. And just as immoral as those thousands of years ago may have seemed to us, those thousands of years from now would seem immoral to us if we could see what they were going to be, because they're going to be different social material conditions giving rise to different moral phenotypes. And therefore the idea of an arc to me is just an illusion. Okay, Charles.
just one comment. So I know, because like I've heard this argument before, that some people might suggest that human morality can be anything. And like you know, like the blank slate arguments, for example. And I don't think that's the case. It seems like there's
you understand I'm not saying that though, right?
No, I know. I just want to clarify that just for the listeners. Yeah. I know you're not saying that. Yeah. But my point is that there seems to be structure to human morality, and it can vary, but there's limits on how it can vary. It can't just be just anything. So I mean, even though, like, you know, 2,000 years in the past and 2,000 years in the future, these, and you know, today, these moral kind of like ethical frameworks that people prefer, that's common for people to prefer, can be, you know, very different, and also look, you know, to each other, look horrific. It's still, it seems like it can only exist within the structure, within the biological structure that we have for this moral stuff. So it can vary, just, it can't just be anything. It has to still fit within that structure.
Yeah, and that's the whole concept of reaction norm, right? That's the reaction norm, is capturing the idea of the limited constraints of what kind of phenotypes are possible.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. If you look both forward and back, right, all we're talking about is different locations within the reaction norm, right? So the 2,000 year ago world might have been over here in the reaction norm, and we might be, you know, over here in the reaction norm. And 2,000 years from now, they might be, you know, they might be over here in the reaction norm, right? It's just like different locations of the reaction norm because of the different environmental conditions that are giving rise to the specific moral phenotypes.
Yeah, and of course, when you're saying over here, you're talking about a population average, and of course, like different individuals are going to be in different places, but just like here and there is just more about like the average of this population that we're just looking at as we define the population.
That's right. And there's always going to be outliers, and maybe even far outliers. But what constitutes social norms is sort of where you get a cluster of moral phenotypes that are similar enough that some kind of social norm can emerge from them.
Yeah, and it seems like that variation, for example, like can have structure, right? And like, for example, like Kurzban looked at that data, as you pointed out, in the GSS data. Yeah. And he seemed to find structure between, you know, self-interest and, you know, within this, say, socioeconomic class and dislocation, there might be some, you know, shared common interests, and these individuals might form coalitions in different ways against other groups. But of course, within the group, like you were pointing out, like there's competition between them too, right? So it's like, even though there's, if you bring it back to reaction norm, even though that's, there's, you know, a population average, and then you have a bunch of individuals who aren't necessarily, and probably are not at the population average, they vary along that it's not just random, in a sense, that there's structure there, and that structure interacts with each other, which is kind of interesting too. Yeah.
Well, you know, I think, it just occurred to me, I think that we've both maybe all sort of, when we talked about this abortion stuff, gave credit to Kurzban, but you know, the fact of the matter is, I think that abortion research was actually the doctoral thesis of Jason Whedon, the co-author of the book. So we should give Jason his props for that research on the abortion stuff. In fact, it was his work on the abortion stuff that encouraged Kurzban to collaborate with him on the book, looking at, you know, different kinds of breaking down different issues.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that's my position. That's the way I see it. So I don't know if you guys agree with that, disagree with that, or if you have different points you want to make. I mean, anything else you want to say about this whole issue of a moral arc?
I mean, just to be clear, that doesn't mean that we're in any way saying, well, we should just revert to how we've been in the past or anything like that, right? Like we're not making any sort of prescriptive statement.
No.
And we would all agree that a lot of things that humans have done in the past feel very morally repugnant.
Of course, because we are one of these moral phenotypes appropriate for that have emerged because of the particular social material conditions in which we live, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's of course we feel that way, It's you don't want to get away with this, and it's I maybe want to reprise a couple of points that Charles made earlier. Actually, I mean this, what we're talking about now is kind of the software of morality, but there's a hardware, right? And we're all evolved to be moral, right? It's just that what that means in different contexts, is different, right? And you wouldn't want to. Even when you recognize, and again, reprising something Charles said, even when you recognize that your morality is basically self-serving, that's, I mean, some people might, well, that's terrible, and I should stop being moral or something. No, I mean, like that's, the same argument can be made about love. Once you find out that, the reason I love my children is because it benefits my genes, so that they're well cared for, and go, oh, I should stop loving my children, right? Because that's so selfish. I mean, this is stupid, right? I mean, we're here, a successful species, and relatively successful individuals, because because we have these adaptations to allow us to be effective in our world, and to just abandon this stuff because it appeals to some kind of frailty. And this I guess actually there is something kind of funny here, right? Because it's part of our sort of social norm. This particular cluster of moral phenotypes and this particular location of the reaction norm where we are, one of the weird things around this particular social morality is that you're not supposed to be selfish, right? At other times and places, being selfish wasn't nearly as bad a thing as it is for us, right? So we get this sort of ironic thing that somehow, if anything's called selfish, that somehow it's bad. Well, no, that's not the lesson to be drawn from this at all. Go ahead, Charles. Go ahead.
People use the word selfish, but I think like if you're more of a specialist, you might think of it a bit differently. Like if you think of it in terms of like positive sum situations versus negative sum situations, right? So for example, like cooperation, you can be selfish where I get what I want and you get what you want, but this is a positive sum situation. Like we both benefit. We're both better off for doing this, right? I think when people talk about selfishness, just using normal everyday language, I think they're referring to a zero-sum situation, right? Like where like you benefit, but the person loses as a result. I think that's what they're talking about.
In fact, I would go further than that and say, not only is that what they're talking about, but I think that most people assume that that's the only way you can even understand the concept. If you're acting in your self-interest in any way, someone else must be suffering in some way. I think that's
right. I think it's construed as antisocial behavior.
I'm sorry, I missed the last bit there, Patricia. So what do you say?
Oh, sorry. I would just say, they would equate it with antisocial behavior.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I think it's more or less, it's more or less assumed that, that implies some kind of antisocial behavior. That's right.
Yeah.
So, are we agreed that the moral arc is a confused idea that needs to be rethought? Is there?
Yeah, I mean, you could maybe come up with a different notion that's maybe somewhat similar to a moral arc, but maybe not the same. This is the way the other people conceived of it. And someone may have already said this, for example, like I think you mentioned, like people pointed out with the world getting richer, for example. And maybe it's possible that as the world, you get more material wealth and you maybe need less competition of a certain kind, right? Like for material stuff, which doesn't mean there's no competition, right? You get other kind of competition, maybe like sexual style competition. But as you have that, then the moral phenotypes that you're more likely to have change, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think that, and without going, too much into the nitty-gritty of it, I mean, I think that, we can pat ourselves on the back about getting rid of slavery, which, isn't completely gone, obviously, but largely gone as much as we want. But the fact of the matter is that once you get into a certain level of market economy, a certain level of technological development, slavery just isn't a very efficient form of economy, right? You know, and I think that's part of the issue here is the social material conditions change, morality is going to change because different things are beneficial to people.
Yeah, there's different ways of, let's say, the rent-seeking elite to extract wealth from people rather than just slavery, right?
And Charles was the one who wanted to know, but I want to make sure we're going to talk about politics.
And I mean, yeah, I guess I just also want to like point out that it's still a very interesting discussion to talk about how morality has changed. We just take an issue with sort of like some of the language or the sort of like the patting yourself on the back about what a good person we are now, right?
Yeah.
But you know, it's perfectly interesting to talk about and document how it's changed and what's happened in different points of human history. And also that, like, I mean, if you do want to talk about morality in like a transcendental capacity, you can absolutely do that. You just can't do it from sort of a like a biological perspective.
Right, and all these people we're talking about, you know,
Exactly.
very much pride themselves in being naturalists, right?
Exactly. So that's the sort of the perspective of this discussion.
Yeah. So is that it? Have we covered it?
I think so.
All right. Well, Charles, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're going to join us again in the future. We're going to have probably our next show is going to be on intelligence, and you're going to join in on that one too, I think, right?
Yeah. There was a period of time, maybe about a decade or so ago, that I was really into the psychometrics around intelligence. So I'm a bit rusty on some of it, but I think I remember enough of it.
Okay, well, we look forward to doing that. And Patricia, lovely to see you again as always.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I just wanted to note too that always our original conception of the show would be the three of us. So it was really fun to have Charles on, and I think that this is going to be a fun thing going forward. So
yeah, looking forward to it. All right then, so you two hang on. I'm going to sign off here. I got to set this up here. All right, so there we go. So I'm going to say goodbye. Goodbye, Charles.
See you. Bye.
Bye, Patricia.
Bye, Michael.